In 1981, a struggling but alive neighborhood in East Detroit was demolished to build an auto plant. A local church became the center of opposition. In the late 1800s, Polish immigrants came to Detroit for job opportunities. In the 1920s and 1930s, more came for the expanding jobs in manufacturing. Poles were also attracted to the area's Catholic churches. Catholicism is a part of Polish identity, so a Catholic church was integral to preserve who they were while establishing themselves in America. Likewise, they were needed to create schools that would teach the future generation Polish language, history, and of course, Catholicism. However, Polish people faced discrimination. They were left with dangerous jobs at the lowest positions. Poles had to fight for the right to unionize. They rejected assimilation, but Poles had to fight for their churches too. Poles came to live among those who spoke German. These immigrants attended St. Joseph's, a local German-speaking Catholic church. But Poles wanted a Polish church, with a Polish priest. However, the hierarchy of the church was not Polish, and they were not meeting the needs of the Polish parishioners. So in 1871, with the approval of Bishop Borges, the St. Stanislaus Kostka Society and about 300 families came together to create the first Polish Roman Catholic church, St. Albertus. St. Albertus continued to attract more Poles to the neighborhood, and eventually the area became known as Poletown. A later priest, Father Kolinsinski, developed a large following and fundraised for church buildings. However, the father was reluctant to surrender parish funds to the diocese. He was controversial, and the parish split into fractions. In 1886, he was fired by Bishop Borges. Polish parishioners wanted the father to come back, so in 1888, he and his followers worked to establish their own parish, outside of the jurisdiction of the Roman Catholic diocese, the Sweetest Heart of Mary. The father was excommunicated for establishing an irregular church, but continued to create the largest Catholic church in Michigan, seeing about 2,000 on its first day in 1893. The father was apparently reinstated in 1897. Soon enough, there were several Polish Catholic churches in the area. Early immigrants arrived mainly to farmland situated between two railroads. In 1980, it was described as being bound by East Grand Boulevard, roughly the south city line of Hamtramck, the Grand Trunk Railroad, Mack Avenue, and Mount Elliott. In the 1880s, the area was lower income but thriving, with Polish shops and small, well-kept homes. Since its establishment, the area was constantly becoming more diverse, with the arrival of other immigrants and ethnic groups such as African Americans. In the 1960s, about 1 out of 4 people were Polish, and in the 1980s, about 1 out of 16 were. Even 100 years later, in the 1980s, homes remained tightly knit, as well as the community. One resident reflected that they wouldn't want to live in the suburbs because people were by themselves too much. Shane Street was a business district. The street linked Poletown with Hamtramck and had a streetcar bringing people to its bakeries, meat markets, clothing stores, and so on. There were also stores and restaurants mainly catering to Polish clientele. In the community, there were also Polish funeral homes, a Polish newspaper, a Polish seminary, and the first Polish vaudeville theater in the U.S. Wiley writes in her book that nothing had changed since the Detroit News wrote in 1883 that the residents live and retain their customs to such an extent that the whole region nearly resembles a fraction of Poland than a part of a city in the heart of America. However, Poletown and Detroit were facing economic hardship. 42.5% of families reportedly were living below the poverty level, and by the 1980s, Detroit was losing its auto industry and post-war manufacturing power. Even though more than half of the Polish population had lived in Poletown for over 20 years, a sign that the Polish community was strong. It was also shrinking and aging. But there were several community efforts to revitalize the neighborhood, some of which were held by the churches. 2 residents convinced the head of the city's Community and Economic Development Department to tour Poletown. He expressed it had a lot of potential and that Detroit needed neighborhoods like this. Detroit wanted neighborhoods to initiate programs that worked with the city. But GM proposed to build its first factory Detroit had seen in decades. In June of 1980, it was announced. In Hamtramck, it would be where the closing Dodge main plant was. But there was one big problem. Detroit would have to demolish 1/3 of Poletown. That is 3,438 residents, 1,362 households, 143 institutions or businesses, 16 churches, 2 schools, and a hospital. The city would pay residents $12,000 for their homes, sometimes with additional money for relocation. Many residents, including Poletown Citizens District Council, were open to the factory, some wanting the nicer homes outside of Poletown afforded by Detroit. But whether or not they wanted to leave, the city had enacted its newly passed Quick Take Act. They could take land and give it to private interests for economic development. There was resistance. and they were held at the headquarters for the Archdiocese downtown. The church hierarchy, which agreed to sell for $1.2 million their churches, St. John the Evangelist and the Immaculate Conception Roman Catholic Church. In the summer of 1981, Immaculate Conception had become the primary location for resistance. The Polish pastor of the church, Joseph Karasiewicz, led protests in opposition to the demolition. To go down to a very basic definition of stealing, it's simply taking other people's property against their will, and this was taken away from them, the people, against their will, the priest said. While the neighborhood around them began to disappear, residents, parishioners, and other supporters at Immaculate Conception signed petitions, raised funds, and started a letter-writing campaign to save the church, the latter of which attracted nationally known consumer advocate, lawyer Ralph Nader. After Nader gave press releases from the basement of the church, the country became aware of the conflict in Poletown. Jeannie Wiley compared the conflict to fascism, and a protester compared it to the Soviet Union. One held a sign reading, "Your home and job could be next. Fight back." It was called corporate socialism. One resident said that those in opposition presented opinions of a small minority as if they represented the whole neighborhood. While most residents accepted the money, on a financial front, the amount didn't always cover the costs. On an emotional front, not only GM, the two cities, the Archdiocese, and some residents supported the plan, but so did the UAW, and even the federal government. One resident reflected, "When I saw it was a losing battle, I backed off. What could I do? We were going to fix these homes up. This is where we lived, and this is where we are going to die." Crime was on the rise as people began to vandalize, scrap, and light houses on fire. John Saber built a cement wall around his house and guarded his porch with a gun. He was a retired photographer who lived in his home for 46 years. He was offered $15K, but instead sued the city and GM for $15 million, but in the end was forced to leave. There was blight, and many, including the younger generation, left. GM eventually offered to move the Immaculate Conception, but Cardinal Dearden, in his last official act as head of the local archdiocese, vetoed the move. They argued that the churches were no longer profitable and attendance was declining. The pastor said they could have supported themselves, having more than $100K surplus on hand. But earlier in March of 1981, in response to a lawsuit filed by residents, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the statute was constitutional. Church authorities told the priest that the final Mass would be held on May 10, 1981. 1,500 worshippers came. He was then told to leave the property by June 17th, and did so, but refused to turn over church records. That month, after the Virgin Mary was knocked down by vandals, a small Madonna was held by young Douglas Locklear in a walking vigil with other parishioners and friends. Then on July 14th, a 29-day sit-in at the church came to an end when 60 SWAT officers vacated 20 people and arrested several Polish women as they whispered prayers, 3 of which were from Poletown. Their cases were dismissed. Already, the church was surrounded by police and the demolition company. One person slipped under the fence and ran into the church, while another climbed over it and refused to leave a bulldozer. A group of young activists rushed the fence multiple times, but the police had also stopped them. By nightfall, the pastor prayed while 200 others cried and watched as a wrecking ball struck the church. The demolition occurred just a day after the sit-in. Artifacts were removed from the building beforehand, but some were still being removed in the front, such as ceramic tiles and stained glass, while it was being demolished in the back. The plant opened in 1985. There were good jobs, but never as many as the 6,000 that GM had promised. In 2018, in part because of automation, only 1,500 people were employed at the plant. That year, with car sales dropping, GM decided to close the plant. The plant acted as a physical barrier between Hamtramck and the rest of the town. While giving a haircut in their barber shop on Chain Street in 1985, Nokoma's tally reflects on how it used to be packed in here. Workers were not leaving the factory to enjoy the goods and services that surrounded them. Rather, high fences separated them from the world of Poletown. Today, much of the neighborhood is empty. A study by the University of Michigan found that 87% of former Poletown residents older than 60 and 84% of younger residents were happy in their new homes. But one resident said, "They destroyed our roots, our home, everything." Some businesses and institutions are dispersed throughout the area, from the Ivanhoe Cafe, also known as the Polish Yacht Club, to the Department of Transportation. There is also a park, a community garden, and yes, churches. Immaculate Conception is now a retention pond. When it was demolished, a wooden cross stood in its place. St. Albertus is maintained by the Polish-American Historic Site Association and holds Mass in English and Polish. The Sweetest Heart of Mary also has an annual pierogi festival, including a church tour, live polka music, and a roomage sale. In nearby church, St. Hyacinth was distributed some of the items from Immaculate Conception, such as the statue of Jesus, while other items went to other parishes. In 2004, the Michigan Supreme Court reversed its decision, ruling that taking property to develop a business or technology park was invalid. GM is now reopening their plan.